If everybody could take a seat, that would be great, because I'd like to get started as soon as possible. My name is Rick Geddes, and I'm a professor in the Department of Policy Analysis and Management, or PAM, at Cornell University in the College of Human Ecology, and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Many thanks to the American Enterprise Institute for sponsoring this event on combating the international shipment of opioids. Remarks from Senator Rob Portman. I'm not a political science professor, but I think the Senate might be a busy place today. So I wanted to quickly get into the sort of meat of the event. I do want to thank Wilson Shirley in the back for helping to get this organized event, and it really, truly could not have happened without the support of the American Enterprise Institute, for which I'm enormously grateful. So let me introduce Senator Portman, and he'll make some remarks, and then we'll go to Q&A on this issue, which I'm not going to go into in detail, just to say that it mixes up a lot of different, very important policy issues together, like national security, social issues like addiction, and also international legal issues, also economic issues like utility regulation type of issues. So there's an amazing amount of important issues wrapped into this topic that are becoming more and more important every day as e-commerce grows and as the international shipments from around the world into and out of the United States increase almost on a daily basis. So let me introduce Senator Portman. Rob Portman was first elected to Congress in 1993, representing Ohio's 2nd District for 12 years. He left Congress to serve as U.S. Trade Representative and then Director of the Office of Management and Budget in the George W. Bush administration. In 2010, he was elected to the United States Senate, where he has been a leader in combating the opioid epidemic. He authored the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, which became law in 2016, and recently introduced CARA 2.0 to direct more resources to combat the opioid epidemic. As chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, Senator Portman led an 18-month investigation into how overseas drug traffickers ship synthetic opioids into the United States. His bipartisan legislation, the STOP Act, would close that loophole in our international mail screening process that has allowed this to happen. The House passed the STOP Act in the summer of 2018, and the summer passed it in September of 2018. During his Senate tenure, he has introduced more than 240 bills, more than 200 of them bipartisan, and more than 50 of those bills having been signed into law. So let's welcome Senator Portman. Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it.
Rick, thanks very much. This is kind of timely because I think tomorrow at roughly 10:45 a.m. and 30 seconds, the House of Representatives is going to pass the conference report that has the STOP Act in it. And it will be identical to the STOP Act that passed the Senate. And then I think the Senate will take it up, the conference report, in the next couple of weeks. And it'll be in the President's desk, and it'll be enacted into law. So this discussion is timely because it's about kind of, I think, an example of how we got here, how it's going to make a difference, and how we have to ensure that it's properly implemented. And I think it will make a difference in my state and around the country. And to Rick, thank you very much. He didn't mention that he happens to be an expert on the Postal Service as well, and so he's someone we relied on for his expertise. He came to the Homeland Security Committee to talk about some of the financial challenges facing the Postal Service, and he also talked about this issue, and we appreciate his expertise today. Also want to thank Jim Campbell and Julian Koo, and also my former colleague and former Secretary Tom Ridge, who's going to be with us this morning. You got a great panel, and I look forward to hearing from them, or if I have to run, hearing about what they said, because this is a crazy day on the Hill. Let me just say this. I've been involved in this issue of substance abuse and pushing back, starting with the prevention side for about 25 years. And started my own anti-drug coalition many years ago in my hometown, and I'm the author of the Drug-Free Communities Act and the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act and other legislation. And that coalition, by the way, is still very much active in Cincinnati and very important in pushing the prevention, the education message out. But more recently I've become very focused on this fentanyl issue and the synthetic opioid. And I have because it's the #1 killer in my state. The new data came out just yesterday from Ohio for 2017, and it showed, sadly, that we had an increase in overdose deaths. And that increase in overdose deaths was primarily driven by one thing, which is synthetic opioids, and specifically fentanyl. So, you know, this is personal. I'm not suggesting that dealing with this issue we're going to talk about today is the only solution. It's not. But we have to apply the tourniquet because this drug, which is so powerful, remember 50 times more powerful than heroin, so relatively inexpensive, and we can maybe get into that in the Q&A, but I pose this to experts in the field, including law enforcement, undercover agents constantly, and the bottom line is it's less expensive, ultimately. And no wonder, because a few flakes of it, you know, is enough to cause an overdose, is enough to kill you. So some evil scientist somewhere, usually, I'm told, in China, is making this concoction, and usually, not always, but usually it comes through our own United States Postal Service into my communities that I represent. I first heard about it probably 6 or 7 years ago when I was in the Montgomery County area, Dayton, Ohio, and law enforcement were talking about this new drug that was coming in, and it was being shipped to abandoned warehouses, you know, to addresses where there weren't people living. Of course, we'll talk for a second about it going to post office boxes and so on, and they indicated at that time that there seemed to be a movement toward this rather than heroin. And indeed, again, now, if you look at these grim statistics I talked about, it has pushed out heroin and other drugs. From 2013 to 2017, across the country, 850% increase just during that 4-year period in overdose deaths caused by fentanyl. 72,000 deaths last year in America, as you know. More than 48,000 of those involved opioids. More than 60% of those were caused by fentanyl. So my state, particularly hard hit, and particularly hard hit by the synthetic opioid crisis, but everyone's being hit by this. And again, the #1 killer is fentanyl. Let me say, once we make progress on dealing with one drug in this country, other drugs tend to crop up. And one of the, I think, great mistakes we tend to make is we take our eye off the ball. And so crystal meth is making a comeback in certain parts of our country. Cocaine is making a comeback in certain parts of our country. And if we do have success with regard to the STOP Act and with the additional prevention, treatment, and recovery resources that are provided through the CARA legislation, the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act, of which I'm a co-author and a strong supporter, or the CURES Act, which I'm a strong supporter, which sends money directly to the states, we will see other drugs begin to come back and cause some of the same heartache and pain. But at this point, we have a responsibility to apply that tourniquet and specifically to stop some of this flow of fentanyl, this poison, into our communities. How did we get here? Back in early 2017, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which I chair, began an investigation into fentanyl. Why? Because, again, I was hearing about this back home. We saw the rise in it. We decided that we wanted to pursue legislation, but this may be an example for some of you who are following Congress and thinking, can Congress ever get anything done, and how do they operate, and is it really an institution that's working these days? I would suggest humbly that this is an example of how you ought to do things, which is it was bipartisan from the start. It was based on a serious investigation, an 18-month investigation, and it resulted in legislation that's going to make a difference in the lives of the people we all care about and I represent. So that's how we did it. We conducted an undercover investigation using Homeland Security investigation special agent, a detailee. We posed as a buyer. We contacted literally hundreds of websites around the country. We narrowed our search down to 6 websites, and over an 18-month period, almost 2-year period, we were able to look at the data from those websites. We were able to use payment and shipment information that we were able to receive through using our subpoena power. And through that, we were able to, as an example, identify 3 individuals in the United States who were distributing drugs they received, apparently. Information, by the way, which we passed along to the U.S. Department of Justice. 2 who also purchased items to mass-produce pills from the fentanyl they were receiving. In just these 6 websites, again, following the payment data to the individual, we were able to identify 7 individuals who had died of overdoses shortly after receiving their fentanyl shipment. Think about that. 6 websites we focused on. We were able to find 7 individuals who died shortly after receiving their shipment of fentanyl from an overdose. So it was pretty obvious from this investigation and simple Google searches that this is an issue that is rampant on the web, and that people were openly selling, seemingly without any concern of what the law enforcement consequences might be. What was perhaps most interesting is that these websites told us that they would guarantee delivery if the fentanyl was shipped through the U.S. Postal Service. If it was sent by FedEx or UPS or DHL or another private carrier, there was not that guarantee. No better evidence than Congress needs to act. As some of you know, right after 9/11, Congress did act, and we put in place legislation at that time focused on explosives and other contrabands that said that if you're sending something into the United States as a private carrier, you have to require that the sender provide electronic data in advance so that the law enforcement officials can be provided that data. You know, where it's coming from, what's in the package, where it's going to. Tom Ridge was Secretary of DHS at the time. He was happy to get that information because after 9/11 there was a heightened interest. For reasons that we can talk about later, the post office was exempted. Instead, the legislation required that the Postmaster General and the Secretary of the Treasury report back to Congress, study the issue, and give a report to Congress as to whether it was appropriate for the Postal Service to take on this same responsibility. That was 16 years ago. We're still waiting for that report. It never came. So, by the way, for those of you who follow Congress, we talked about, how this is an example of how things ought to be done. That's an example of how things ought not to be done. That Congress delegates responsibility, and then there's no follow-up. And in fact, in the legislation, there was no time requirement. So I guess 16 years, one could argue, is the time it takes to study this. Now we have the STOP Act. Customs and Border Protection is the group that enforces this law, the 9/11 law, and I've been to the distribution centers at these private carriers. I've been to a couple in Ohio, and it's very impressive. And they have rooms where they look at packages, as you can imagine, because of the fentanyl crisis. These rooms are well ventilated. They have to wear protective gear to open these packages. I know you all have heard of examples of first responders who have overdosed from being exposed to fentanyl. It's very dangerous. By the way, very dangerous for mail carriers, too. Your letter carrier should not be put in a position of carrying fentanyl. Without this information and roughly 900 million packages a year, you can imagine it's like finding a needle in a haystack for law enforcement to be able to identify fentanyl that might be coming into our country. And again, it can be a very small amount. Just last week, I was in Dayton, Ohio, talking to law enforcement there. We had a roundtable discussion, and just as is happening all over my state, they had recently discovered enough fentanyl to kill tens of thousands of people. In Columbus recently, 2.2 pounds of fentanyl was found. That's enough to kill about 500,000 people, the population of Cleveland, Ohio. It is less expensive than heroin, regardless of how you look at it from our analysis. And that combination, the deadliness and the relatively low cost, has led to this incredible tsunami. By the way, I do believe that Congress has made progress with the CARE legislation, the CURES Act, the focus on the Drug-Free Communities Act, because we provided more funding for that in the CARE legislation. I believe that it's making a difference, and I've toured about a dozen different facilities back home in the last year and a half since we passed those bills that are using that legislation well, coming up with innovative ways to close some of the gaps. For instance, when somebody is given Narcan, this miracle drug that reverses the effects of an overdose, to get that person into treatment rather than having that person just go back to the community. So things are happening that are very positive. And my view is that we would have turned the corner by now. In other words, we wouldn't see these grim statistics from last year increasing from the year before, which has been true for the past half dozen years, but for the influx of fentanyl. That this has been overwhelming to a system that is finally getting its act together, and Congress finally getting its act together to begin to address it. The Post Office, we can go into more detail if you like, but they have started to look at electronic data because of the pressure from Congress, and specifically this subcommittee, Permanent Subcommittee investigations. They've testified before us a few times, and they now tell us that about 36% of the packages versus 100% with the private carriers have some electronic data. They have also told us that 20% of the time when they identify a potentially suspicious package, when law enforcement identifies it, the post office cannot produce the package, despite having the 38% or 36% of the packages having some electronic data. By the way, if that 36% were really being reviewed by law enforcement, we would still have 318 million international packages coming into our country every year virtually unscreened. So this is why it's important for us to ensure that we have legislation that requires the post office to do what the private carriers do. It's a loophole, and it's a glaring loophole. So the STOP Act is very simple. It simply says the post office has to meet the same standards as the private carriers. It requires, by the way, within a year, 100% of packages from China would have this electronic data. The post office, as you may know, has been pushing back on this over the years, and including with regard to this latest legislative effort. It also requires that for all the international packages, 70% of those by the end of this year, 100% by the end of 2020, must have all packages covered by electronic data. So this is going to help. This is the tourniquet that we need. Will it solve the problem? No. No. Even if it worked perfectly, and we're able to stop all this fentanyl from flowing into our country from China, which, again, law enforcement will tell you, primarily post office, primarily from China, other countries as well now. Some of it is diverted into Mexico and brought back in a pill form, which, again, we were able to show through our investigation that happens sometimes. We do need a longer-term strategy here. We do need to deal with this epidemic as the disease that it is and get people into treatment and longer-term recovery, because then the chances of treatment being successful are much higher. We need to do a much better job on prevention and education, having been at this again for more than 2 decades. I'm not happy with the progress we've made in terms of getting the message out, including the connection between prescription drugs that are legally prescribed and the opioid addiction that leads to often the use of heroin and fentanyl and other opioids that leads to overdoses and deaths. So there's lots more to do. But today is an opportunity to pause and celebrate one small success, which is the House passing this legislation, and then in the next couple of weeks having it signed into law by the President. So thank you for letting me come by this morning to talk a little about it, and you're going to have a great panel here to get into more details. Thank you.
There's some ready.
Yeah, far away. Good.
Please wait for the mic.
Hello, Jay Rich, Reason Foundation.
Hey, Jay.
And I'm curious, opioid prescribing has decreased a lot since 2010. And how much of the fentanyl use that we're seeing right now can be attributed to the decrease in prescribing that's happened since then? And have we considered any sort of way to meet the demand in a safer way other than consuming it on the black market instead, maybe through substance abuse, how would you put it, medically assisted treatment?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to your question in terms of the less less prescriptions of opioids and the correlation, I will say that they're still overprescribing, significant overprescribing. And I say this from not just the data. In Ohio, I think we've had a 26% decrease in prescribing over that period of time. That's good. But when a young person comes to your office and says, now that Ohio has passed this really tough law saying opioids can only be prescribed for 7 days, and then you have to go back and get another prescription, so I just had a wisdom tooth extracted, and they gave me 14 Percocets for wisdom tooth extraction. I don't know if you have your wisdom tooth taken out, but if you did, you probably weren't given opioids. I wasn't. And there's no reason for it in the vast, vast majority of cases. It should just be zero, because 14 pills, 7-day supply can lead somebody to an addiction based on the information we now have from FDA and also from CDC and other sources. So, by the way, in my legislation, there's a 3-day limit on prescriptions, which is not able to pass the House or Senate right now because there's pushback from the medical community and the pharmaceutical community, but there still is overprescribing. But I don't know the exact, correlation there. I will say that, to your point, and I think it's a good one, the most urgent need is for non-addictive pain medication. I mean, why is it that we haven't had a non-addictive pain medication that has the ability to handle some of these, particularly chronic pain situations like people take opioids for, in the last few decades? I mean, to me, it's a huge gap in our ability as a country to respond to this. And the new commissioner of the FDA seems to agree and indicates he's going to move ahead with some approvals that have been in the pipeline for a while for non-addictive pain medication. Wouldn't that be kind of an obvious answer here? So my hope is that within the next year or so, you're going to see more drug companies step forward and say, we have an alternative here that has the same sort of broad-based pain relief, but will not lead to a change, literally in your brain, which some of the experts will talk about today, that leads to a disease called addiction that then leads to all these other consequences. So I think that probably is the single most important thing I can think of to address what you're talking about. I do support medication-assisted treatment. I think it has to be customized for every person. But part of the legislation that will pass the House today includes something that I fought for, which is to raise the IMD exclusion, for reimbursement for treatment centers. There's been this cap on 16 beds, and it comes out of, frankly, the deinstitutionalization on the mental health side many years ago, and it doesn't fit our current needs, where you have good treatment centers who can't provide treatment for people that turn them away because they've hit the limit on residential treatment. And so we increase the ability for people to have access to treatment. At the same time, we require that those treatment centers that want to have the cap removed provide medication-assisted treatment, because I do think that option is appropriate for a lot of people. Yes?
Thank you, sir. Carl Golovin, retired special agent, U.S. Customs Service, also a 9/11 responder, domain reference, and idealliveson.net. Sir, a question important to ask is, who is the ultimate beneficiary of creating addicts at any level? And I'd reference a book by a very reputable author, Douglas Valentine, titled The CIA as Organized Crime. CIA co-opted the leadership of DEA along the way because they are involved in the international drug trade, and it was beneficial to have DEA, with the game plan. But you mentioned China, how we got here. For historical context, in the 1840s, Britain went to war with China to compel China to allow the importation of opium, to create addicts, to create revenue for the crown. And as a result, Britain gained control of Hong Kong as a free port for the next 150 years. Hong Kong's turned back to China in 1997. No one in the media talks about how Britain ever gained control of Hong Kong, or where did Britain ever renounce the trafficking of opium as a means of creating revenue for the crown? So I'd ask you to investigate who actually controls the global drug trade, perhaps ask a hard question or two of the director of the CIA, and why U.S. troops guard the poppy fields of Afghanistan in conjunction with intelligence interests. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, you raise an interesting point that isn't lost on the leadership in China in terms of the opium wars. And I've been to China. I went last year. to talk specifically about this issue and spoke to Premier Lee as well as the chair of the People's Congress about this issue. And one point I made was that by not cracking down more on the fentanyl production, both in terms of the rogue scientists who are doing this, as I said, evil scientists sending this poison to our country and other places, but also with regard to some of these chemical companies that apparently are in China using their facilities, perhaps in off hours, perhaps not, but they can crack down more. But if they don't, this will, and it already does, I'm sure, but will leak into their own communities. And so they have a self-interest here. But you're right, there is this visceral recollection of the opium wars, and for all the more reason they should be interested in cracking down on this to avoid it having a bigger impact on their society. It's a tough issue for us to get the data as to what's really happening in China, to be frank. But I'm sure that they have seen some leakage because of, again, the power of this drug. Other questions? Sorry. Yeah.
Chris Hauer, ONDCP. Two questions, if I could. One is regarding, in the past when China has dealt with methamphetamine production and diffusion in their own country, they cracked down on that, and because that was a problem that affected Chinese citizens. Whereas fentanyl consumption within China is, to my knowledge, not high, not comparable to what we see in the United States. To what extent?
Nothing is comparable to the United States.
That's exactly right.
It doesn't mean it's not a problem there, and I would love to follow up with you to find out what that data is, because I can't. We're not able to really find it.
Yeah, and I would love to talk to you about that as well. But to what extent has Congress or any agencies that Congress works with, such as DEA, DOJ in general, identified specific individuals within the Chinese government that are part of, or outside of the Chinese government, that may be part of regulatory capture and allowing this production of fentanyl basically to occur? And a second follow-up question is there a concern over, because of the potency of fentanyl, over the aerosolization or weaponization of fentanyl, either within the United States or elsewhere, and that could come to the United States?
Two great questions. As some of you know, and I don't know if DOJ is represented here today, but DOJ has actually indicted Chinese nationals on fentanyl transport, selling fentanyl and being involved in the trade. And these are individuals who live in China, and China has refused to prosecute. And it's not unusual that they wouldn't extradite individuals, since that's their practice, as is the case of other countries, admittedly. But they should be pursuing these individuals. And I have made that point, as you can imagine, with my Chinese counterparts, including the ambassador from China. They can do more. There's no question about it. And they should work with us, to provide law enforcement information on individuals who are heavily involved. I will say, our sense, and we got some experts here, Andy can correct me, is this is diffused. In other words, it's different than the trade in some of these other drugs. Let's say heroin, where there tends to be a cartel involved, there tends to be a centralization, and then a distribution network. When you can sell something directly to a post office box in the United States, as we experienced, and have these individuals then sometimes be users, usually distributors, but we talked about the 7 people who died. And for what we can tell, it doesn't appear as though there were large shipments sent to those individuals. There's enough, obviously, to kill them. So it's a little different to get at it, and it requires a more broad-based approach, more of a intergovernmental enforcement effort that has a broad net. What was your second point?
My second question had to do with, it's such a potent drug, and when you mentioned how first responders.
Yeah. Okay, let me give you an example of that. So, 3 weeks ago, on the anniversary of 9/11, I was in Chillicothe, Ohio, at the VA Medical Center, where every year they have a 9/11 ceremony, and very emotional. I'm sure Tom Ridge goes to the one in Pennsylvania every year. This was one where you have veterans and first responders speaking about their experiences in 9/11. The week before, at the Chillicothe Correctional Institute, which is right down the street, you drive right past it to get to the VA, a prisoner did exactly what you're suggesting. And, I've been suggesting this for several years because I think it is a real problem, which is the possibility of this becoming essentially a chemical weapon. And in this case, it was a weapon that was used against guards and against other inmates. 17 guards and inmates went to the hospital. It also happened in Pennsylvania, I believe the same day, Tom. I don't know if it was coincidental, certainly the same week at a correctional institute there, that there was an aerial spray somehow made. In this case, it was fentanyl, I think, just simply thrown into a fan. So, I'm not the expert on it, but I think you're absolutely right. I think this has a much broader implication that nobody's focused on, and another reason for us to figure out ways to tighten this tourniquet quickly to avoid this poison from being spread. Listen, thank you all very much for being here. I'll let the experts get at it here, and I thank AEI for letting me come forward this morning.
Let's thank the Senator. Thanks for all your work on this important issue. Thanks so much, Senator. Yeah, thank you. So in the interest of time, I think I'll have our panel come up. And again, thanks to the Senator for all his hard work. We're very hard hit by this in upstate New York, where I live. And it really is an epidemic. So it's great to have the Senator doing this hard work. So I will introduce our panelists, and I'm glad to see Professor Koo was able to make it in from Hofstra. And Governor Ridge, so why don't you guys come up, and I'll just go ahead and introduce, standing directly to my right is my friend and educator on this issue. International postal issues were not my strong suit before chatting with Jim, and most of my work is on domestic postal policy issues. So Jim is a lawyer and consultant in Washington, D.C., and is a longtime advisor to the Federal Express Corporation on U.S. postal reform and international postal policies. In recent years, he has co-authored several major studies of European and international postal laws and practices for the European Commission, and a review of the history and development of postal law and the postal monopoly in the United States for the U.S. Postal Regulatory Commission. And next to him is Professor Julian Koo, who is professor in the Maurice A. Dean School of Law at Hofstra University. His primary research interest is in the relationship between international law and constitutional law. Since 2014, he has served as the faculty director of the international programs overseeing Hofstra's Law Study Abroad, Exchange, and LLM programs. And he's also been selected as the John DeWitt Gregory Research Scholar and a Hofstra Law Research Fellow. He is a member of the American Law Institute and the New York Bar Association. And next to him, and we're into titles at universities, you may know, and I'm not sure what title to use here, whether it should be secretary, governor, staff sergeant. I don't know, but we'll stick with Governor Tom Ridge. As the chairman of Ridge Global, he provides clients with solutions to cybersecurity, international security, and risk management issues. Following the tragic events of September 11, 2001, he became the first assistant to the President for Homeland Security, and on January 24, 2003, became the first Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He served as Secretary of the U.S. Department. He served as Secretary of DHS until February 1, 2005. Before September 11th, Governor Ridge was twice elected governor of Pennsylvania. He served as the state's 43rd governor from 1995 to 2001. After his first year at Penn State University's Dickinson School of Law, he was drafted in the United States Army, where he served as an infantry staff sergeant in Vietnam, earning the Bronze Star for Valor, the Combat Infantry Badge, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. After returning to Dickinson, he earned his law degree. He later became one of the first Vietnam combat veterans elected to the United States House of Representatives, where he served 6 terms. Governor Ridge serves on the boards of the Institute for Defense Analysis, the Center for the Study of Presidency and the Congress, and other public and private entities. He's currently chairman of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce National Security Task Force and graduated from Harvard with honors. So I've asked our panelists to make remarks on each of their sort of respective areas of expertise, which are hopefully clear from their bios. And we'll start with Jim, and then maybe do a little interaction amongst the panel after each of them speak, and then go to Q&A from the audience. So if you can have some questions teed up for them, I think that'd be good. Jim, you want to go first?
Fine. I think I've got some slides. I don't know how to get Okay.
They're too small.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so I have some slides. I guess the slides will be on the AEI website. There's no way I can go through these slides in detail, but I thought that they might provide some information for you to go back and look at. So I have two jobs this morning. I'm supposed to give you a little introduction to the UPU and also to talk about one of the problems, terminal dues, and the other two panelists will speak of a couple of other problems. The UPU is an intergovernmental organization. It is the second oldest intergovernmental organization. It was founded in 1874 by 21 countries. Since then, it has grown to 192 countries, essentially all the countries in the world. And as you can see, with the increase in countries after World War II, it's now majority controlled by the representatives from Asia and Africa. Although everybody has one vote at the UPU, among the 192 countries, the distribution of mail is very uneven. In fact, 5 countries account for probably more than half of all of the international mail, and 30 countries account for about 92% of all the international mail. The bottom 100 countries, majority of the UPU, probably account for less than 1% of the mail. The nature of the international postal system is changing fundamentally. In essence, international documents are declining rapidly, more rapidly than domestic documents. And the international postal system is becoming a package service, primarily serving e-commerce. So this graph will give you a little bit of a sense of how international documents are declining, the red line, over the last 2 decades. And the package business is increasing, although the documents are still twice as many as the packages. In terms of value and in terms of weight, the packages predominate internationally. The package business is a competitive business, unlike the document business, which is basically just the post offices. In the package business, the private express companies basically control the market. But in the normal package e-commerce business, the post offices have the majority of the business. This is most of the information regarding international package system is secret. This is a slide that the Chinese Post showed last year. It shows the growth of e-packets, which is a portion of the packages that the China Post sends to the United States, the growth over the last 6 years. This is how the UPU is organized and how they make decisions. At the top is the UPU Congress, which is an assembly of all of the governments in the UPU. They meet once every 4 years to make decisions on the acts of the UPU, which, including the Universal Postal Convention, which is the main treaty for the international exchange of mail. There are 2 permanent standing committees that do the work between Congresses. The Postal Operations Council is the key. It's 40 countries, but it is essentially 40 postal officials. And they not only manage the business strategy of the UPU, but they also adopt regulations which are binding on countries. This is what a UPU meeting looks like. This is the last General Congress in Istanbul in 2016. So this is the Postal Operations Council. The names in blue are the countries that have been on the Postal Operations Council since it started in 1994. In essence, the Postal Operations Council is a committee of the big post offices, and the major ones have permanent seats. Council administration you can look at later. The authority of the UPU to bind the United States is one of the essential issues here. The Universal Postal Convention, which is adopted every 4 years, is binding on the United States if the United States approves it, if they consent to be bound. At least that's my understanding, but it's not necessarily the understanding of the Postal Service, which argues that the United States is bound whether or not we consent. There's also regulations which administer the convention. These are adopted by the Postal Operations Council, by a committee of 40 postal officials. All right, that's binding on the United States. Without it, there's no specific consent mechanism. Okay, so here, what are the problems created by the UPU? Well, there's essentially 3 kinds of problems. First one has to do with terminal dues and other charges. The post offices do not charge each other the same as they charge their own citizens for the delivery of mail. And the result of this is both anti-competitive and economically distortive. I'll talk about terminal dues in just a minute. Customs and Security, the UPU has various customs and security provisions which are not the same as applied to non-postal packages. And in the last 2 decades, there's been a great increase in concern about protecting the borders for obvious reasons. The UPU has not kept up. And so the customs and security provisions of the UPU, which, at least according to the UPU, override national provisions, create the kinds of problems that Senator Portman just mentioned. Finally, there are constitutional and legal issues which arise from the very unclear interaction between what the UPU does and what international law, and particularly the U.S. Constitution, requires. Professor Koo is going to explain all that, I hope. Okay, so let me just talk then a few minutes about terminal dues and what's involved. Terminal dues are essentially what post offices charge each other to deliver inbound international mail. In fact, technically it's letter post. The letter post is not only documents, but parcels up to 2 kilos, and therefore it's essentially all the e-commerce. Terminal dues are fixed by the UPU convention. It's essentially a price fix agreement. And the rates are not the same as Americans are charged. So just to give you there's no way I can get into the complexity of the terminal dues, but let me just give you a quick story about what happened in the post office in Gray Eagle, Minnesota last Saturday. There was immediately as the post office opened, there was a long queue of people that wanted to send a 1-pound package to colleagues and friends in the neighborhood. The first was Fred D'Angelo. He's an old resident of Gray Eagle. And the clerk knew him. He says, "Fine, Fred, that'll be $6.70 for your 1-pound package." That's the priority mail rate today for a 1-pound package, local delivery. The next was Inspector Van Tome. Inspector Van Tome was visiting from Belgium. And he was there for a particularly grisly murder. The clerk says, Professor Van Tome, that'll be $2.79 for you. The next visitor was, the next person in line was Mr. Chilich. He's a tennis player who came in to play a tennis tournament. He's from Croatia. The clerk says, $2.31 for you, Marin. The next guy in line was this big 6'7" Chinese, Ping Chong. Ping Chong is from China. That was clear, but the clerk had to consult his special price list for UPU people. He says, "Are you from Hong Kong or mainland?" So Mr. Chong says he's from mainland China, and the clerk says that'll be $2.11 for you. And then there was this young lady visiting from Canada. And
it's a busy post office.
The clerk takes one look at her and says, Miss McAdams. And he whispers in her ear something that is a secret. Nobody knows what the terminal dues is from China. Well, after that, there was a riot in the Gray Eagle post office. All right, now this is only a slight exaggeration of what's going on with UPU terminal dues. More precisely, there are 4 groups of, the UPU has divided the world into 4 groups of countries, and the terminal dues vary depending on whether you're sending to or from one of these groups of countries. Group 1 is about 28 countries. It's the industrialized countries. So it's Western Europe, it's US, Canada, it's Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. And one set of terminal dues, the highest set, applies to packages that are charged on packages sent between these industrialized countries. The next group, Group 2, is what you might call the high-level developing countries. And the terminal dues for them are a little bit lower and a little bit different, and that applies to the packages and letters sent between those 24 countries and also between those countries and Group 1, and so on. So you wind up with 4 different sets of terminal dues, which is why everybody got a different rate at the Gray Eagle post office. All right, as I say, it applies to envelopes as well as packages up to 4.4 pounds, 2 kilos. Now, understand the terminal dues are compensating the destination post office only for delivery. All right, so the original cost, the cost of gathering the mail and sending it to the United States, is borne by the origin post office. And there's a separate compensation for long-distance air transportation. So we're really talking about the cost of local delivery, which the UPU estimates is about 70% of domestic postage. In terms of volume, the terminal dues fall differently because the amount of mail sent by the different groups is different. But let me just say, for small packets, because developing countries, particularly countries like China and Singapore, are sending a lot of packages, the terminal dues rates for the first three groups apply to most of the packages and fairly equally. So all three of the top terminal dues rates are important. Now, the actual terminal dues rates are just too complicated to explain, so I will be glad to do that some other time. But in simple terms, this is what it looks like in terms of packages coming into the United States. For a 1 pound package, the retail rate is $6.70 right now, 2018. The UPU estimates that about 70% of domestic postage is the same as what terminal dues is compensating the post office for. So we can call 70% of the retail rate the equivalent domestic postage, and that would be $4.69. The terminal dues that we actually collect on packages that comes in from different groups are shown in red. So $1.95, for example, if we get a package from Germany or England or Japan or Australia, that's only about 42% of what the UPU estimates is the equivalent domestic postage. And the same for Group 2, which is Hong Kong and Singapore, but a little bit less. Group 3, which is China, Brazil, Russia, Mexico, and so on, we're charging about 31% of what we are charging Americans for essentially the same service. Now, if you do this for all the different weight steps, you get a chart that looks about like this. And I'm not going to go through it all, but just at the bottom line there, the small packets. The small packets is where the distortions come from. And we are charging, this shows you from 2000, for the last decade, 2011, and then projected forward to 2021. So if you look at 2018, we are charging about 52% on average for small packets. This is a weighted average that takes into account the fact that some weight steps have more packages than others. I'll be glad to explain how I did this if you want later on. Okay, so this is from Group 1, the industrialized countries. This is Hong Kong. This is Group 2, Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea, and so on. We're charging in 2018 about 43% of what we charge Americans. This is Group 3, which is China and Mexico, and what is it, about 40% there. And then this will just give you a little graph of how the terminal dues as a percentage of equivalent domestic postage has evolved over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, the UPU pledged to align terminal dues with domestic postage. As you can see, they haven't done it. So right now at the end, for packages, the terminal dues is around 40 to 50% of what we charge Americans. It's not going to get any better, and it hasn't gotten any better over the last 2 decades. So that is roughly, that's an introduction to terminal dues. I'll be glad to answer questions, and thank you very much, Rick.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Just a quick question for Jim. To correlate this to what Senator Portman said, if you were to think about where the majority of fentanyl is coming in, and it's no one knows the answer purely, but is it small packets? If you had to estimate?
Yes.
Okay. And so the lesson of this is we're effectively not subsidizing, but the rate structure is.
We're certainly undercharging.
Undercharging.
And we are. We're probably subsidizing too. We're probably charging less than the out-of-pocket cost.
Okay, just to link that. Great. Professor Koo, why don't you take it away on the international law and constitutional issues? Okay. And thank you for making a heroic effort to get here.
It was, thank you. Thanks to American Airlines for making it harder than it needed to be. Thanks, and thanks for having me down. By the way, I haven't been at AEI for, I thought they took me to the wrong building because I haven't been here
Yeah.
in 5 years.
No, this is the right place.
This is a whole new AEI, so congratulations. So as I said earlier, I'm not an expert on postal law or postal policy. But what I think is useful to think about, what I think is interesting here is, my focus has been on the way international law interacts with United States law, especially United States constitutional law. And so the UPU and international postal agreements is a great case study in this broader question of how the United States should interact or does interact with international organizations and with international law. So, it's going to be my contention that the U.S. is not bound by the recent 2016 UP Convention under either international or domestic law, and this appears to be something that the U.S. Postal Service does not agree with. And I want to make a point, discuss a point which I think is very interesting. I have substantial doubts as to whether the U.S. is legally bound by the regulations that the Postal Operations Council issues, which, in my view, may constitute an excessive delegation of federal power under the U.S. Constitution to an international organization. Okay. So before I begin, I want to sort of start with some basic principles. So what we have here are international agreements. International agreements between states take many forms. They do not have to, but the general idea is that states get together and cooperate and sign agreements. There's no particular mechanism required under international law for being bound by an agreement. So you can sign an agreement and you're bound. You can exchange instruments. You can ratify. You can accept it. There's lots of different mechanisms. Under the Universal Postal Union Constitution, the Acts of Union, which include the Universal Postal Convention, shall be governed by the constitutional regulations of each signatory country. This is Article 25.4. So what this means is that although the Universal, this is confusing because they're all UPC, but the Universal Postal Constitution sets out a very formal procedure. You have to sign it, then you have to ratify it, then you have to take your document that you ratified, and you got to take it down to this depository and literally deposit it. And it's sort of like a contract where you're formalizing the contract, and that's the procedure by which countries are bound. But actually, the other types of agreements, not the Constitution, but the Universal Postal Convention, or don't specify this particular mechanism. So a lawyer is not as formalistic. What it says is that whether you're bound depends on the domestic law of a particular country. Whatever the mechanism that country has for binding itself is how we'll judge whether or not you're bound. So that brings us back to a topic I think we all love here in America, American law. And in fact, constitutional law, which is one of the classes I'm not teaching right now because I'm here. So the U.S. Constitution, as hopefully all of you know, requires a treaty to be made by the President and then approved by 2/3 of the United States Senate. You'll notice that none of the agreements, if you haven't noticed, you will, none of the agreements here we're talking about here will have gone through that process. None of them are treaties as defined under the U.S. Constitution. Instead, what we have here is this sort of alternative mechanism for making international agreements that's grown up over the years called congressional executive agreements. So this idea is that the President makes an agreement, but instead of taking that agreement to the Senate, he either just makes the agreement on his own authority or he takes it back to Congress for its approval. Not the Senate, but for a majority of each house of Congress. Some of you may be familiar with an agreement called NAFTA. I know it's trendy in D.C. these days, right? Or the World Trade Organization. These are, it used to be boring. No one knew about them. Now they're like everyone's favorite agreement. Those agreements are made this way. So the President makes the agreement, then he goes back to Congress, and they have to approve it. The postal agreements are a little different because they are pre-authorized congressional executive agreements. So Congress has passed a general statute authorizing the Secretary of State to make agreements, binding agreements on postal matters without going back to Congress for approval. So it's sort of like a general delegation, go out there and make agreements. It's in 39 U.S.C. Section 407b1. The Secretary of State shall have the power to conclude postal treaties, conventions, and amendments related to international postal services. So this mechanism is then he can just go out and make the agreement, and he doesn't have to come back. He's done. That's the agreement. So this is a little sketchier under the Constitution, although the fact that this has been going on for roughly 150 years with respect to postal agreements suggests that this has been accepted in U.S. practice. It wasn't always. It used to be the Postmaster General, but now it's the Secretary of State because Postmaster General is not a federal officer anymore. But the Congress, of course, has imposed limitations on these agreements. He has to consult with the Postal Regulatory Commission. So it's not a total blank check, but it is a broad delegation of authority to make agreements that the Secretary of State can make. So now let me just sort of break it down, and I know the law stuff tends to bore people, so I can see that. You guys, it's early in the morning here. So what it means here is that this process is really driven by the State Department. The State Department, and of course, the Secretary of State's a busy man. He's off to North Korea every few weeks. So he doesn't have time to go to the Universal Postal Union Congress meetings. He's got other things to do. So he sends his delegates. He sends the very fine people in the State Department to go represent him. So as far as I know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the Secretary of State does not attend the Universal Postal Congress, right? In fact, I'm not even sure the Assistant Secretary of State.
Right.
It's not high on the agenda of top issues, which is probably why this has happened. So the U.S. So the process, though, for joining these agreements is that we send our representatives to the United States. They sign the agreement on behalf of the United States, but this is not the Secretary of State. These are his minions, so to speak. That doesn't bind the United States under international law until he comes back and gets the Secretary of State to approve it. The Secretary of State, under the statute, is clear. It's not his whoever he delegates it to. It's the Secretary of State who must approve it. And so that's generally been the process, I think, at least since 1965, since the U.S. has joined these agreements. Now, the Constitution, as I mentioned, UPC Constitution, we had to definitely do this process. What's interesting, and this is the part I don't fully understand because I'm not a postal law expert, so we've been doing this process, but the last time I think this process has been formally followed, where the State Department representatives went to the UPC, then they came back and the Secretary of State formally approved. He has to consult with the Postal Regulatory Commission. He's got to disclose, makes all sorts of reports to them, and then he can approve it. The last time I think this is done was 2008, actually. I don't think they actually did this, but they had a Postal Congress in 2012 and in 2016. But for reasons I don't fully understand, the Secretary of State has not formally given his approval to those agreements that were made during those two meetings. So as a formal legal matter, the United States is not bound by, it's bound by the Constitution of the UPC, but it's not bound by the 2012 or 2016 Universal Postal Conventions, which are basically updating of the general treaties and rules that govern these issues. So I don't fully get this. Maybe someone here is from the State Department can tell me what's going on. It got lost in the mail somewhere. That would be ironic. But it is we're not. So the United States is not formally bound under international law. There are some arguments otherwise that have been made, perhaps by the U.S. Postal Service, but we signed it, right, and that should be enough. But as I point out, the statute makes it clear that if we're going to go through this non-treaty method of making an international agreement, we got to follow the statute. And the statute says Secretary of State, and it says it's got to be him. He has to follow the procedure, and they haven't done so, as far as I can tell. Now, the U.S. because the U.S. is a signatory to the agreements, it has a duty not to defeat the object and purposes of the agreement. In other words, we can't go around undermining the agreement. But we're not bound. We're not a member of those two agreements, so we're not bound by those most recent agreements, which means the United States Postal Service is not bound as a legal matter to follow whatever the decisions of the Universal Postal Convention were made in the 2012-2016. My understanding is that they've been treating it as if they're bound. But my analysis is that they're not actually bound and they don't actually have to do this if they don't want to. It would not violate any obligation under international law. So it's worth taking a step back and saying, look, how do we get here? And what happened here is that the United States wants to cooperate in many ways with international. We have many different kinds of these sort of technical agreements that are made, like the Postal Union, like the Telecommunications Union. You know why the telephone numbers are like 1 and 2 and 3, whatever, area codes, country codes. So these are types of things that we want to do, and we want to create a mechanism that's less unwieldy than going through 2/3 of the Senate. So there's a lot of reasons to like this sort of alternate mechanism. But the danger is when we get sloppy, we don't follow the rules, we don't stick to these statutes and the legal mechanisms that we've created for this. And I think that appears to be what's happened here, at least. And so my argument is that we really need to make sure we stick to the letter of our domestic law. Otherwise, these agreements really do lose their legitimacy and actually technically aren't really even legally binding. Okay, so let me just quickly make one more point here. The other most interesting part for me of the postal system, the whole international postal UPU agreement system, is what they call the regulations. So if you look at the UP Constitution, Article 22.2 declares the Congress, UPU has not the Congress, there are these things called general regulations that will be binding on member countries and shall not be subject to reservations. And then it goes on to say that the regulations shall be drawn up by the Postal Operations Council, bearing in mind the decisions taken by the Congress. And then it says the Postal Operations Council shall be responsible for operational, technical, economic questions. So unlike the Universal Postal Union Congress, which is made up of representatives of the member countries, the Postal Operations Council, I imagine, are a bunch of
Postal people.
Postal people. I don't know who they are. I guess they're folks like you, maybe, right? People who know a lot about postal.
They're not like me.
Let me put it. They do not represent governments. They are not officially appointed by governments. They are, I guess we would call them international postal bureaucrats, if there's such a thing. If there was such a thing, that's who they are. And it's a technical administrative body. The member countries don't have any supervision over them, but they're making rules which are binding on the member countries. And under domestic U.S. law, we would call this a delegation to an administrative agency, like the Federal Communications Commissions or the Securities Exchange Commission. And we would scrutinize those delegations for excessive delegations because essentially we're giving lawmaking authority to these agencies domestically. What we've done here is give lawmaking a very limited but certain kind of lawmaking authority to, I'm not sure if this is mysterious, but kind of under the radar Postal Operations Council of, I like this term, international postal bureaucrats who are making all these rules governing the Postal Service that, frankly, most of us don't care about. But from a lawmaking process, as a constitutional lawyer, it's troubling. Like, who are these? How can they make rules binding on the United States? They're not even representing the United States. The United States never consented to them either under any legal procedure, other than what we might imagine was a delegation when they originally signed on to the Postal Constitution back in 1965. The theory here is that we delegated the authority to them back in 1965, and so we're just have to live with what it is. That's a delegation, and I'm troubled by that. I've written in the past, I've argued that this is a problem because unlike a domestic governmental agency, we have very little leverage over these international postal bureaucrats. We don't control their funding. We can't call them in to yell at them in a congressional hearing. We can't pass laws even taking back the authority we gave to them. Well, we sort of can. So I think that there needs to be careful scrutiny given to this mechanism of the regulations. That's why Congress, I think, is good, should not be scared off by the prospect of going against the Postal Operations Council. It's okay. Because I think Congress needs to serve a role as a check. One thing they can do is just pass laws saying, well, look, it's not binding within the United States. We're not going to follow those rules. There are rules that we simply are not going to follow. And it would not, it's sort of, or at least set forth some sort of mechanism for reviewing within U.S. law whether or not the regulations are things that the U.S. wants to make binding within the United States. I think this is the type of thing that happens increasingly because there's so many technical areas of cooperation the United States wants to have: aviation, telecommunications, space, other things. We're going to want to cooperate with we need to cooperate with other countries, but how we do so and the mechanism and the way we do so, that's the realm of constitutional lawyers. We've got to get this right, and this is a job. And the first step is just to figure out what's going on and pay attention to it, which is hard enough. And the second step would be then to come up with rules and procedures and mechanisms that would make those procedures and work better and work more effectively and work more legitimately for the U.S. system. So that's my general take. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Professor. That's great. So let's just go to Governor Ridge. And obviously, there's many different angles to this, as I think all three speakers have suggested. And you have such a strong national security background. Maybe addressing some of those issues, as well. But you also have a law degree, so take it away.
I appreciate the kind words. Particularly, it's been very, I think, very educational, very provocative to listen to my colleagues. It was worth my visit just to listen to both of you. So thank you. I don't know if I could be maybe I'll be more provocative than intellectually stimulating. But let's put all the cards on the table here. When I was Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, one of the primary missions was to deal with the possibility of a weapon of mass destruction. That's certainly beyond what occurred on 9/11. If you're one of the 33,000 families from 80 countries, then it was a weapon of mass destruction. But there's a lot of political conversation about WMDs. And they're nuclear, and they're radiological, and they're biological and chemical. Well, fentanyl and carfentanil is a chemical weapon. It is a weapon of mass destruction. And it's flowing unimpeded into this country in many ways. But the notion that you can get on the dark web, use your mouse, order some fentanyl, and by the way, if you don't know what it is, grab some salt or a couple grains of stand, put it in your hand, and think about ingesting it, and you're done. That's how deadly it is. And if you're a first responder and show up in response to someone who's in distress because of their consumption or exposure to this, and you get exposed to it, you may be hospitalized as well with a serious problem. So let's call it like it is. It is a weapon of mass destruction. It is being made around the world, but there's enough evidence to suggest the primary source of the synthetic is China. On the dark web, those who play in those spaces will tell those who are sending it in, these chemical manufacturers who make this synthetic drug, don't send it by private carriers. So you can order it, you get instructions where and how to send it, and bingo, it's in the neighborhoods. Now, I've been a consultant for, we call it ASAP, Americans for Securing All Packages. And unfortunately, I've had to do interviews around the country with local journalists when this young couple or this individual or a group of people died because of fentanyl. And no one, and Senator Portman didn't say that closing this loophole, and we're going to talk about that loophole in the Postal Service system, is going to solve the problem. But the matter of fact is, in 2002, Senator Portman referred to it, the Trade Act it was called. Congress required, and for whatever reason, they just applied it to the private carriers, and he mentioned it, DHL, UPS, FedEx. There's a small bit of electronic security data they have to send in. Who's sending it? Who's receiving it? What are the contents? How many pieces? How much does it weigh? And that may need a lot to you. But in the world of data these days, they can build an algorithm because certain addresses appear too frequently, both sending and receiving, but they can build an algorithm. So right now, at these international centers where the packages come in, they just pick them out randomly. Random selection. Whereas UPS, FedEx, and DHL, they've got an algorithm that applies to those packages, and they'll find contraband, a lot of other things. So the STOP Act basically says to the Postal Service, that's why I like your interpretation best, in spite of the fact that it says these regulations are binding on everybody. But the fact of the matter is that when they send it to us from China, they don't have to provide advanced electronic information. That's all we're asking. Because based on that information and the algorithm that was created, there was a Cargo Security Act, I think it was 2010, that authorized and created the algorithms that be applied to this selection of high-risk packages. That's all we're asking. Now, here's the sad part about it. The Postal Service is somewhat resistant. I'm being kind, I think.
Yes, you're being kind.
They're kind of resisting it, and they hide under the umbrella, well, we're members of the UPU, we go back to 1875, blah, 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 and we can't do it. By the way, they've got bilateral agreements with countries where they could enforce it, and they don't even enforce it there. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands, I, for one, view this, it's a medical problem, it's a cultural problem, there's a lot of issues, there's a tsunami of issues related to this thing, but it's a weapon of mass destruction. Do you know that opioid deaths last year exceeded those fatalities in automobile accidents? Do you know that it exceeded fatalities with gun violence? That's how bad it is. And the fact that we know that one of the areas of concern is the illegal acquisition through the mail system of these drugs, and we can't even give our basic law enforcement community, Customs and Border Protection, this information, tied it in with the algorithm, so instead of running around picking out suspicious packages, they can at least focus in on what they consider to be the high-risk package. That's all we're doing. Now, the second problem will be, and I can say this as a former member of Congress. Actually, it's a lot better of governor because you could almost say, so let it be written, so let it be done, and you get it done. So you can't do that. Here's the challenge. You can pass that law. Now we got to get the Postal Service to do something about it. And they will be resistant. They will be resistant. I'm just flat telling you. That's why I like your interpretation. Because I think it holds a lot of water. It's not a treaty. And by the way, let's be real, and let's be somewhat sympathetic to the fact that, no, I don't want to be sympathetic to the Postal Service. I mean, I just can't. Because if someone in the Postal Service had a loved one perish because somebody in that neighborhood or they themselves accessed fentanyl illegally and consumed it unfortunately and tragically, I'll bet they'd have a different point of view. And so I think the real challenge for those of us who are concerned, again, this is not the answer. This is not going to solve all the problems with fentanyl. Let's be sure of that. You can start closing these points of access, which is very important first step. So the challenge will be, and the president's going to sign it clearly. I'm delighted it's bipartisan. I'm kind of surprised it took a couple of years to get it done, but I guess Congress moves at glacial speed, and that's okay. Better they move at glacial speed than no speed at all on this issue. But the real challenge will be enforcing it. Congress effectively said, close the door. So the next question is, what are the levers that the general public and those of us who are concerned about it to say to the Postal Service, lock it? That's it. Strong letter to follow.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. I'll just one. So this is terrific. My head is spinning with all the issues that are here. But let me ask Jim and Professor Koo. I'm not an attorney. I'm an economist. But the way I normally think about these types of issues that you raised as being resolved is through litigation. And I know this agreement was signed by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965, I think, that you both referred to. But has there been any sort of court attempts to resolve the bindingness of these international agreements on the United States government?
I guess
I don't know which one of you guys.
I don't know if there has not been, and there's a lot of reasons. Courts are hesitant to get involved in any issues that relate to foreign affairs. There has been litigation over the trade agreements, and they've essentially said that they are okay. The trade agreements are okay because they're subsequently approved by Congress, and they have to deal with international commerce, which is within Congress's power. So I think it would probably. I don't think litigation. I think there would be there. I'm not sure there's a forum where the courts want to get involved. Although I think there has been litigation which is related to the Montreal Protocol for ozone reduction. A lot of these environmental agreements for air pollution have a similar technical structure, pre-authorized agreements. There are treaties, but then the treaties authorize subsequent agreements. It's the subsequent agreements, the follow-up agreements that people lose track of. And courts have been more skeptical that the subsequent agreements that were made pursuant to an original agreement that was validly made are themselves valid. So there's a possibility of some pushback there, although I'm not sure how this would come up here. I don't know. I guess a lawsuit could be brought against the USPS if they refuse to follow some of these rules.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Could the United States enter into a bilateral agreement simply with China?
Yeah, sure they could.
There's no restriction on them doing that, is there?
No.
No, we do. And the Postal Service
They could, under the terms of the UPU Constitution, in fact,
Right.
enter into a special agreement.
And if they want to follow UPU protocol, I guess one of the first tests would be, all right, if you can rely on UPU to say we don't have to do anything, we in Congress saying, well, but you can have a bilateral agreement, so go get one.
Right. So as a practical matter, in terms of the packages that come in the United States, so terminal dues, customs, everything, we're only getting a large number of packages from a fairly small number of countries.
Exactly.
Maybe 25, 30, 35, something like that. All right. So the United States could practically get the 35 countries together and say, let's come up with a better system. All right. And that kind of an idea has been talked about and is something might come out of that.
The
Right,
numbers I've seen before say that there's over 1 million packages a day in the Postal Service. Was that accurate? I mean,
the Postal Service is very secretive about how much it gets, but that's probably about right.
okay.
About 300 million a
But
year.
they could unilaterally go in. You mentioned 5 countries. You had Germany, France, UK, China, and US. 54%, right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. So if we could be, and I only want one of them right now, but they could do a bilateral or multilateral
That's right.
agreement with the major users of our Postal Service, and that would be consistent with UPU, and they
Right.
could avoid any of the legal heartburn associated
Right.
with trying to
Right.
force it on everybody.
For me, that's the reasonable short-term solution. Long-term, fix the UPU. Short-term, just get the big package shippers together and let's work on proper compensation for delivery, proper customs and security controls.
I'm just going to ask Governor Ridge one more, and then we'll go to Q&A. If people can stay a few extra minutes, we're
If
delayed
you're
waiting.
running for Congress, I'll vote for you again.
I'm done.
Done it.
Been there, done that.
But we were waiting for the
Governor's
senator.
a better job anyhow.
So Governor Ridge, and I've heard it from Jim in offline conversations, the senator alluded to it, you alluded to it. The STOP Act is good, right? It's going to do some good things. It's the electronic sort of a manifest before the incoming shipments occur, but it's a relatively modest measure.
Yep.
What could we do? The scale of this problem, and I can tell you in upstate New York, is mind-boggling, right? And disproportionately affecting young people. Let's say it. It's horrible for the nation. What else could we do as a country that would be a bit more aggressive to address this? That would, hopefully go beyond the STOP Act.
Well, I wish I had the answer to that. I think I'm going to just refer back to, I think there's a growing appreciation of the severity of this problem. If all politics is local, the number of journalists that I've discussed this issue with and some of my colleagues was that the number of communities affected by this, and I think the STOP Act is also, not only in addition to closing this loophole, trying to elevate in the world of the medical community, the pharmaceutical community. I mean, there's a lot of different components to the challenge of reducing the opioid epidemic. Over-prescription, you might want to start with that. Perhaps even more easily prescribing it. Monitoring the level of dosage. I don't know if that's actually in the legislation, but I've read some articles where instead of giving them 30 days worth of, look, let me have to use a personal reference. I've been in a couple of situations where I had severe pain. I'll bet you have too. I mean, I'm talking severe pain. Question becomes, if you ever thought the pain you had to endure required 30 days worth of strong painkillers. I think it's unlikely. So I think you start with changing the doses, monitoring who gets what, making sure the pharmacies are plugged into this. I like the notion that maybe some of this treatment be covered under Medicaid. So I think there's a variety of different things we need to do. You can start with the dosage, oversight, get the farmers involved, access to the antidotes, countermeasures, and to your point, I'm glad you raised it, and then start closing the loophole. I mean, the Congress said close the door, and we want Postal Service to lock it.
Right.
Rick, let me just clarify one thing. The original STOP Act that Senator Portman introduced would have treated the Postal Service just like any other importer of packages.
Okay.
So they would have to make entry, as they say,
Right.
for packages that come in.
Make
They say, this is what's inside. If there's any incompleteness or inaccuracy in this information, I'm liable. Here's the duty, and so on and so forth.
Right.
All right. The Postal Service fought back very hard,
Against the STOP
and this was taken out. And so the current STOP Act requires the foreign posts, in cooperation with the Postal Service, to provide security information, but the Postal Service does not make customs entry. They are not liable for incomplete or inaccurate information.
Okay.
All right, so what could be done further, and simply in customs control, and customs will not fix the drug problem, but in terms of customs control, they could move further down the line towards treating the Postal Service, to treating postal packages like any other package. All right? And that would be a step in the right direction.
Right.
Can I just ask a quick question? We're all bashing the Postal Service. Do they have what is their reason for opposing, other than the cost of these new regulations?
Unclear.
What was the answer?
No, it's unclear. I mean, the Postal Service, it looks like the Postal Service is losing money at all this.
Yeah. Right, why do they even oppose terminal dues? They're losing money on terminal dues.
They're making, it's complicated. The Postal Service is making, they have, while they're undercharging on the inbound, other post offices undercharge them on the outbound. Historically, the Postal Service was a net exporter. They've become a net importer because of the rise of China. It looks like they're misreading their own self-interest, to me. But since the Postal Service keeps all this information confidential, nobody really knows what's going on in terms of the effects of the UPU on the Postal Service.
I'm sure there's a lot of people with questions, so why don't we go to... Yes, sir.
Hello. Hello. Yeah, my name's Ron O'Kelly. I'm a member of AEI, a taxpayer, an unhappy consumer of the post office. But I'd like to ask one question. We talk about packages and we talk about documents that were mailed. Why can't you just say to the post office, no more packages? We have bills of lading, we have freight forwarders, we have all sorts of ways to get packages in this country. Why do the packages have to go through the post office?
That's a Jim Campbell question, I think, right?
Well,
or anybody who wants to take it.
The post offices, as I explained, the international postal system has really become a package system. And they carry a lot of packages. They carry probably 2/3 of all the international packages today. Well, the answer is, of course, that the economy benefits from this trade. Now, you could close down the post offices, but it would be seemingly a lot simpler simply to control them, simply to improve the controls. It's only the packages parts that's really the distorting issue. That's the main problem. That's right. But the president, I perhaps not everybody knows, but the president on August 23rd issued a memorandum, a directive to the State Department. And the UPU held an extraordinary Congress in the first week of September. And so on August 23rd, the memorandum says basically to the Secretary of State, as long as we're having an extraordinary Congress, go out there and negotiate new arrangements that takes care of these problems. So the president is saying, I want to make sure that we're not charging foreigners less than we're charging Americans, and I want to make sure that Customs and Security data is upgraded to basically to protect Americans. So that's what the presidential memorandum said. Now, what actually happened was the State Department went to this extraordinary Congress in Ethiopia and did nothing. All right, so we didn't make any progress there. But the White House is now looking into the situation and it was a challenge. I mean, to be fair to the State Department, it would have been difficult to get anything done, on such short notice. Nonetheless, they didn't really do much of anything. And so the situation now is that this is under active consideration at the White House as to, just how do we deal with this issue? And what they're looking at is trying to improve the controls rather than try to shut down the whole international postal system.
So right there, you had one, we'll give him one. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Phil Hoxie. I'm a research assistant here at AEI. And this can be for anybody. I was just wondering, how do you actually implement this system? So the private sector has had to do this, and I assume they do it in a system that's sort of like sampling. They build a model on the sample, and then they use the electronic data to actually pick out packages based off the model they've built to see what's dangerous. And is that a legitimate question, building off what that gentleman over there said, to ask, can the U.S. Postal Service actually implement and comply with this, what they need to do? And do you have any experience with what the private sector has actually done? Because the metadata alone is not enough. So there has to be a screening process or something.
So just let me explain. Governor Ridge explained the process. So the private carriers provide data on every single shipment package that comes in the United States. And Customs and Border Protection runs this through an algorithm and says, we want to look at this and this and this and this and this. And there's a certain amount of randomness that just, pick one randomly. Now, is that perfect control? No. But the private companies have a strong incentive to comply because they get fined if they make mistakes and they're caught. And as they make a lot of mistakes, they could be shut down, and that's their business. So the system works pretty well. Does it work perfectly? No, but it works pretty well. All right.
It's an imperfect system, but all we're asking in the global economy, which is more intense every day, more packages every day, is that you provide information. The cost is virtually non-existent. Well, whatever. Just give us 7 pieces of information. We'll build up a database. Based on that database and the algorithm we create, the Customs and Border Protection at these 5 or 6 international sites, when all this mail comes in, they won't be just rummaging around, picking them out indiscriminately. Our intelligence community and other resources tell us certain high-risk areas, perhaps certain high-risk communities, certain high-risk companies that we think are producing it. You get the algorithm, attach it to the package, pull it up and look at it. That's not too much to ask. Now, it's not a perfect system. I'm sure some things will get through it. It's a lot better than the system we have now.
Okay, so you ask, can the post offices do this? And the answer is, the people that send us a lot of packages are not the post offices of, Mali and Sudan and wherever. The people that send us a lot of packages is Deutsche Post, which is a privatized corporation that's operating all over the world, or PostNL in the Netherlands, or the Royal Mail, or China Post, or Singapore Post, which is 15% owned by Alibaba. All right, those post offices can invest the money to develop the information systems if they have to. And if you tell them you're not going to send any more packages to the United States until you do it, they'll do it. All right, and it's not only the United States; the European Union is also beginning to crack down on this, this lack of information. All right, so can those kinds of post offices do it? Yes. All right, can the very small developing post offices do it tomorrow? No. All right, but so you give them some time. All right, but most of the packages that come to the United States are being sent by large, sophisticated, and in almost all cases corporatized, and in many cases privatized post offices.
Let's just do one more question, and then this gentleman right here hasn't had a chance, and then we'll ask other questions over refreshments. Yeah.
My name is Kevin Fagan. I'm a new D.C. resident. I've had a lot of issues with the Postal Service, and I was actually born in Pennsylvania. So my area of interest...
You didn't move here when I was gov, though, did you?
No, more recently. So I have an interest in effectiveness of domestic oversight and specialized law enforcement. So the Postal Service, like other large U.S. government organizations, has its own inspector general, and then it has another law enforcement component, the Postal Inspection Service. So, number one, what is to be expected of those two components? And number two, back in the 90s, D.C. residents were so annoyed with their local Postal Service delivery that the GAO got involved. And the GAO said, you can go to their website, that Postal Service was doing a terrible job in D.C. delivering mail just within D.C., and it was a human resources problem, is basically what their report says. So what is to be expected of the GAO, the Postal Service Inspector General, and the Postal Inspection Service in this issue?
Okay, so just briefly, the Postal Inspection Service of the Postal Service has been generally supportive of these types of UP reforms and encouraged the post office to cooperate. The inspection service, the regular postal inspectors, are just not involved in it. And GAO has done a lot of studies on these issues, and GAO reports tend to be kind of on the one hand, on the other hand, but they've generally likewise are supportive of these kinds of reforms that we're talking about here.
Let's thank our panelists for making the effort. And I think there's some refreshments outside here, tea and coffee. No, gone.
Very nice
okay.
to meet you, Governor.
There-
Quality.